December 24th, 1967. The mist hung over Kontum Airbase like a shroud, thick with the scent of wet earth and cordite that never quite disappeared from the air. Christmas lights, improvised from colored signal flares and empty ammunition casings, flickered weakly between sandbags that formed the perimeter of what soldiers called home. A portable radio crackled with static as Bing Crosby's voice drifted across the compound, singing about dreams of white Christmas mornings that felt as distant as another planet. The jungle pressed against the base's edges, a living wall of green that watched and waited. Temperature readings showed 87 degrees at midnight, but the humidity made it feel like breathing underwater. Mosquitoes swarmed around the dim perimeter lights, their high-pitched whine mixing with the distant rumble of generators, keeping the radar systems operational. This was Vietnam on Christmas Eve, where peace felt as fragile as morning mist and twice as likely to disappear. Captain Robert Ellison of the 173rd Airborne Brigade sat in the communications bunker, writing in a field journal that would later be recovered from the rubble. His pen moved slowly across water-stained paper, capturing thoughts that thousands of soldiers shared, but few dared voice. The weight of command pressed on his shoulders like the humid air itself, and every decision carried consequences measured in blood and metal. Tonight, for just one night, he allowed himself to believe that war might pause for something as simple as human decency. Outside, soldiers moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of men who had learned that survival depended on never fully relaxing. Guard posts maintained their schedules, radio operators monitored frequencies for enemy movement, and helicopter crews performed pre-flight checks on UH-1 Hueys that would be ready to respond within minutes. The AN/MPS-14 radar system swept the surrounding valleys, its green screen painting electronic pictures of a seemingly quiet landscape. But in warfare, quiet often preceded the storm. The command structure at Military Assistance Command Vietnam had announced a limited Christmas ceasefire, a 24-hour period when both sides would supposedly honor the holiday's spirit. Intelligence reports suggested that North Vietnamese forces might respect this temporary pause, allowing exhausted troops on both sides to draw breath and remember what they were fighting for. Such optimism seemed almost naive in retrospect, but hope has always been a powerful drug for soldiers far from home. General William Westmoreland's headquarters in Saigon had transmitted guidelines for the ceasefire to all major installations. Rules of engagement remained in effect, but aggressive patrolling would be reduced, and artillery fire missions would require higher authorization. It was a calculated risk, balancing political pressure from Washington with the tactical reality that the enemy rarely honored such agreements. The decision reflected a deeper truth about American involvement in Southeast Asia, the constant tension between idealistic goals and brutal pragmatism. Yet even experienced commanders succumbed to seasonal hope. Even they wouldn't attack on Christmas, remarked Sergeant Major William Hayes to his squad leaders during the evening briefing. The comment drew nervous laughter from men who had seen too much to believe in enemy sentiment, but who desperately wanted to believe that some things remained sacred. They hung improvised decorations made from parachute cord and empty sea ration cans, creating tiny islands of normalcy in an ocean of chaos. The enemy, however, viewed American sentimentality as strategic weakness rather than admirable humanity. Across the dense jungle that surrounded Kontum, Viet Cong radio operators received very different instructions through encrypted transmissions. Intelligence intercepts would later reveal the cold calculation behind their Christmas Eve preparations. While the enemy sing, strike. The phrase became a haunting epitaph for American naivety in Vietnam, where kindness was often rewarded with violence. The Viet Cong had designated this operation as part of their broader Truong Son campaign, named after the mountain range that formed the backbone of their supply network. This was not a major offensive, but rather a sophisticated reconnaissance in force, designed to test American defenses and identify vulnerabilities before the massive Tet offensive planned for the new year. Small unit actions would probe multiple bases simultaneously, gathering intelligence while delivering a psychological blow to American morale during their most sacred holiday. The tactical simplicity masked strategic sophistication. Armed primarily with Soviet-supplied AK-47 assault rifle, RPG-2 rocket-propelled grenades, and Chinese-manufactured Type 53 mortars, these small units possessed the mobility and local knowledge that often trumped American technological superiority. Their 7.62 39mm ammunition was readily available through the Ho Chi Minh Trail network, and their weapons required minimal maintenance in the harsh tropical environment that destroyed more sophisticated American equipment. Communist forces had spent weeks infiltrating the areas around major American installations, moving in groups as small as 3 or 4 men to avoid detection by aerial reconnaissance. They established hidden supply caches, marked strategic targets, and identified gaps in perimeter security that satellite intelligence and high-altitude photography had missed. The jungle provided perfect camouflage for soldiers who had grown up in its embrace, turning Vietnam's landscape into an ally for those who understood its rhythm. American intelligence had identified increased enemy activity in the weeks preceding Christmas, but analysis focused on potential disruption of supply convoy rather than direct attacks on fortified positions. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Intelligence Summary for December 22 noted elevated communication intercepts and possible movement of small units, but classified the threat level as moderate for the holiday period. This assessment would prove catastrophically optimistic. The technological gap between opposing forces created a false sense of security among American commanders. Kontum Airbase featured sophisticated early warning systems, including AN-TPS-25 ground surveillance radar, capable of detecting movement at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. M102 howitzers provided responsive fire support, while UH-1C gunship helicopters could deliver precise strikes within minutes of target identification. On paper, the base possessed overwhelming defensive advantages, but warfare in Vietnam had repeatedly demonstrated that technological superiority meant little when the enemy chose the time and method of engagement. The Viet Cong had studied American defensive patterns for months, noting shift changes, guard rotations, and the reduced alertness that inevitably accompanied routine. They understood that soldiers relaxed incrementally during periods of apparent calm, creating windows of vulnerability that disciplined attackers could exploit. Weather conditions on Christmas Eve created additional tactical complications for the defenders. The monsoon season had ended weeks earlier, but heavy humidity continued to affect radar performance and reduce visibility for thermal imaging systems. Radio communications experienced interference from atmospheric conditions, creating dead zones where coordination between units became difficult. These environmental factors, invisible to most observers, would prove decisive in the coming engagement. At 23:47 hours, the false piece shattered like glass striking concrete. The first rocket impacted near the motor pool, its explosion illuminating the night with harsh orange light that revealed the true scope of the attack. Soviet-manufactured 122mm rocket fired from concealed positions in the surrounding hills, arced over the base perimeter with deadly precision. Their high-explosive warheads had been carefully targeted based on weeks of reconnaissance, striking fuel storage areas, communications equipment, and berthing facilities where off-duty soldiers slept. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage in those first terrifying minutes. Soldiers who had been writing letters home or sharing improvised Christmas treats found themselves diving for cover as shrapnel whistled over. The contrast between peaceful celebration and sudden violence created a cognitive dissonance that temporarily paralyzed men trained to respond instantly to combat situations. Christmas carols gave way to shouted warnings and the metallic crash of ammunition being loaded into weapons. Communications Sergeant David Martinez, monitoring radio frequencies in the operations bunker, later described the transition as surreal. 1 second we're listening to Andy Williams on Armed Forces radio. The next second, every frequency is screaming contact reports and casualty updates. His training took over automatically, prioritizing emergency transmissions and coordinating responses between multiple units under fire. But the emotional whiplash remained vivid decades later. The Viet Cong had timed their attack to coincide with shift changes and meal periods, maximizing confusion while minimizing their own exposure. Small teams armed with RPG-2 launchers emerged from concealed positions along the base perimeter, firing at predetermined targets before melting back into the jungle darkness. Their tactics emphasized speed and surprise over sustained engagement, inflicting maximum damage before American firepower could respond effectively. Helicopter pilots sleeping in their quarters rushed toward their aircraft as indirect fire continued to impact throughout the base. Chief Warrant Officer James Thompson, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, described the challenge of conducting emergency startup procedures while 80mm mortar rounds exploded nearby. "You've got to trust your training completely," he recalled years later, "because there's no time to think through every step when people are dying." The AN-MPS-14 radar system detected incoming rockets too late to provide meaningful warning, highlighting a fundamental limitation of defensive technology against close-range attacks. Radar operators could track the projectiles during flight, but the brief time between detection and impact allowed only enough warning to duck for cover. Counter-battery fire required identifying launch positions, calculating trajectories, and coordinating artillery response, processes that took precious minutes while the enemy relocated to secondary position. American artillery responded within 4 minutes of the initial impact, firing pre-planned defensive concentrations around the base perimeter. M102 howitzers chambered high explosive rounds that illuminated the jungle with brilliant white phosphorus flares, creating an artificial dawn that revealed enemy movement along infiltration routes. The psychological effect of American firepower was immense. The thunder of outgoing artillery and the screaming passage of 105mm shells reminded everyone within 10 kilometers that the United States possessed devastating retaliatory capability. But the Viet Cong had anticipated this response, positioning their attack teams beyond the range of pre-planned defensive fires while maintaining effective range for their own weapon. This tactical sophistication reflected years of experience fighting technologically superior forces, learning to exploit the gap between American firepower and American intelligence. They understood that overwhelming force meant nothing if it struck empty jungle while the enemy vanished like smoke. UH-1C gunship helicopters lifted off from the airfield within 6 minutes of the initial attack, their turbine engines screaming as pilots pushed maximum power settings to gain altitude quickly. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades became the soundtrack of American response, a mechanical heartbeat that pounded across the landscape with mechanical fury. Door gunners loaded M60 machine guns with 7.62mm ammunition, checking weapon systems while scanning the darkness below for muzzle flashes that would reveal enemy position. Forward air controllers attempted to coordinate strikes between fixed-wing aircraft and helicopter gunship, but radio interference complicated target designation procedure. The enemy had chosen their timing well. Atmospheric conditions that affected radar performance also degraded radio communications, creating isolation between fighting units that reduced overall response effectiveness. Individual commanders found themselves making tactical decisions without complete situational awareness, operating on incomplete information while enemy fire continued. The attack spread beyond Kontum to include simultaneous strikes on installations throughout South Vietnam's Central Highlands. Firebases at Plei My, Duc Co, and Ban My Thuot reported incoming rockets and mortars within minutes of each other, revealing the coordinated nature of what initially appeared to be spontaneous violence. Intelligence analysts would later identify this as a carefully orchestrated operation designed to test American defensive capabilities across multiple locations simultaneously. At Firebase Charlie, 23 kilometers northeast of Kontum, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez coordinated defensive fires from a bunker that shook with each incoming round. His unit had been enjoying a Christmas Eve meal when the first mortars impacted near their mess hall, transforming celebration into survival in the space between heartbeats. We went from passing around photographs of our kids to calling in artillery strikes on our own perimeter, he remembered. There wasn't time to process what was happening, only time to respond. The enemy demonstrated remarkable tactical discipline throughout the engagement, maintaining fire superiority for precisely the duration required to achieve their objectives before withdrawing in good order. This was not fanatical assault, but calculated violence, executed by soldiers who understood that their mission success depended on surviving to fight another day. They had studied American defensive patterns long enough to predict response times and firepower distribution, allowing them to operate within windows of opportunity that closed as quickly as they opened. Military intelligence officers would later piece together the sophisticated planning that preceded the Christmas Eve attacks. Viet Cong reconnaissance teams had observed and recorded American patrol schedules, artillery response procedures, and helicopter deployment patterns for weeks before the operation. They identified dead spaces in radar coverage, gaps in perimeter security, and communication vulnerabilities that transformed a technologically superior defensive position into a collection of isolated strongpoints fighting separate battles. The psychological dimension of the attack proved as devastating as the physical damage. American soldiers had invested emotional energy in believing that Christmas might provide temporary respite from warfare, making the sudden violence feel like personal betrayal rather than military action. This emotional vulnerability became a tactical factor that enemy planners had anticipated and exploited, understanding that demoralized defenders fight less effectively than those maintaining high morale and unit cohesion. By 0200 hours on Christmas Day, the immediate fighting had ended, but its consequences continued reverberating through American command structure. Casualty reports arrived sporadically as medics worked by flashlight to treat wounded soldiers, their efforts complicated by damaged medical facilities and disrupted supply lines. The contrast between Christmas morning and battlefield medicine created images that would haunt survivors for decades. Wounded men receiving treatment beside overturned Christmas trees, improvised from artillery shells and parachute. Helicopter medevac missions began as soon as pilots could safely navigate the damaged airfield, their aircraft carrying wounded soldiers to field hospitals, while enemy fire continued from concealed positions. UH-1H medical evacuation helicopter, equipped with external medical evacuation pods and onboard medical personnel, became lifelines for soldiers whose Christmas celebration had become a fight for survival. The distinctive Red Cross markings that should have provided protection under Geneva Convention protocols made little difference to an enemy that viewed American holidays as propaganda rather than sacred observance. The tactical assessment revealed both the sophistication of enemy planning and the limitations of American defensive doctrine. Despite overwhelming technological advantages, coordinated small unit attacks had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted significant casualties on an alert and well-equipped defending force. The enemy had demonstrated that local knowledge, careful planning, and disciplined execution could overcome technological superiority when applied at the right time and place. General Westmoreland's headquarters received detailed after-action reports within hours of the engagement's conclusion, but the strategic implications required weeks of analysis to fully understand. The Christmas Eve attacks represented more than tactical harassment. They constituted a deliberate test of American defensive capability and command decision-making under pressure. Intelligence analysts recognized that this operation served as reconnaissance for larger offensive actions planned for the near future. The political ramifications extended beyond military casualties to affect American public perception of progress in Vietnam. News reports of Christmas Eve attacks on American installations contradicted official assessments of improving security conditions throughout South Vietnam. The enemy had achieved a propaganda victory that multiplied the tactical success of their limited military action, demonstrating their ability to strike American forces at times and places of their choosing, regardless of defensive preparations. But the enemy's success came at a price that would become apparent only in retrospective analysis. By revealing their tactical capabilities and operational planning methods, the Viet Cong had provided American intelligence with valuable insights into their command structure and strategic intentions. Communications intercepts recorded during the attack revealed coordination procedures, command relationships, and logistical capabilities that would inform American counter-operations in subsequent months. The response to the Christmas Eve attacks established patterns that would characterize American military operations throughout the remainder of the Vietnam conflict. Overwhelming firepower became the default answer to enemy initiative, with artillery and airstrikes designed to deny the enemy sanctuary rather than achieve specific tactical objectives. This approach reflected both American technological capabilities and the frustration of fighting an enemy that refused to engage in conventional battle, where American advantages would prove decisive. Artillery fire missions continued throughout Christmas Day, targeting suspected enemy positions and infiltration routes identified through intelligence analysis of the previous night's attacks. Forward observers called in concentrations of high-explosive shells that transformed square kilometers of jungle into smoking wasteland, but battle damage assessment revealed minimal enemy casualty. The Viet Cong had achieved their objectives and withdrawn to prepared positions beyond the reach of immediate retaliation. The helicopter war escalated dramatically in response to the Christmas attack, with air mobility operations designed to insert reaction forces into areas where enemy units might be regrouping. UH-1D transport helicopters, escorted by UH-1C gunships, conducted search and destroy missions throughout the Central Highlands, seeking to maintain contact with withdrawing enemy forces. These operations demonstrated American tactical mobility, but also revealed the limitations of conventional military responses to unconventional warfare tactics. Psychological operations specialists attempted to exploit the propaganda opportunities created by enemy violations of the Christmas ceasefire, broadcasting messages that emphasized communist disregard for religious observance and civilian casualty. Leaflet drops and radio transmissions highlighted the contrast between American restraint and enemy aggression, but the effectiveness of such messages remained questionable among a population that had endured years of warfare, regardless of which side claimed moral superiority. The medical consequences of the Christmas Eve attacks extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualty. Combat stress reactions increased significantly among soldiers who had experienced the psychological whiplash of transition from holiday celebration to life-threatening violence. Military psychiatrists documented cases of acute stress disorder that manifested in symptoms ranging from hypervigilance to emotional numbness, conditions that would not be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder until years after the war ended. Unit cohesion suffered as soldiers struggled to reconcile their desire for normalcy with the reality of an enemy that recognized no boundaries between military and personal time. The attacks had violated an unspoken assumption that some moments remained sacred even in warfare, leaving many soldiers feeling that their humanity had become a tactical vulnerability rather than a source of strength. This psychological damage proved more difficult to treat than physical wounds and lasted far longer than the immediate military consequences. Intelligence analysis of captured enemy documents revealed the sophisticated planning that had preceded the Christmas attack. Viet Cong units had received detailed intelligence about American defensive preparation, guard rotation, and commander personalities months before the operation commenced. This information had been gathered through a combination of direct observation, infiltration of local labor forces, and corruption of South Vietnamese security personnel who provided regular updates on American activities. The enemy's intelligence network demonstrated capabilities that American forces consistently underestimated throughout the Vietnam conflict. Local civilians who worked on American bases during daylight hours often possessed detailed knowledge of defensive preparations, equipment locations, and personnel schedules that proved invaluable to enemy planners. The challenge of distinguishing between loyal workers and enemy sympathizers created security dilemmas that had no easy solutions in a counterinsurgency environment. Supply chain analysis revealed that enemy forces had pre-positioned ammunition, medical supplies, and communications equipment in concealed caches throughout the area of operations weeks before the attacks commenced. This logistical preparation required coordination between multiple support units and demonstrated organizational capabilities that contradicted American assumptions about primitive enemy infrastructure. The sophistication of enemy logistics suggested command structures far more complex than initial intelligence assessments had indicated. Counter-battery radar analysis provided insights into enemy artillery capabilities and firing positions that influenced subsequent defensive planning. The 122mm rockets used in the initial attack had been fired from positions carefully selected to maximize damage while minimizing exposure to American counterfire. Enemy gunners had demonstrated remarkable accuracy considering the rudimentary fire control systems available to them, suggesting extensive training and careful preparation for this specific target set. The technological lessons learned from the Christmas Eve attacks influenced American defensive doctrine for the remainder of the conflict. Radar systems received upgrades designed to improve detection of incoming rockets and mortars, while communication procedures were modified to reduce the impact of atmospheric interference on coordination between defending units. These improvements represented evolutionary rather than revolutionary changes, addressing specific vulnerabilities revealed by enemy action rather than fundamental flaws in defensive concepts. Weather analysis revealed how enemy planners had exploited meteorological conditions to enhance their tactical advantages during the attack. High humidity levels that degraded radar performance and atmospheric interference that disrupted radio communications had been predicted by enemy intelligence and incorporated into their operational timeline. This attention to environmental factors demonstrated a level of planning sophistication that impressed even experienced American intelligence analysts. The strategic implications of the Christmas Eve attack became clear only when viewed as preparation for the Tet Offensive that would commence 6 weeks later. Enemy forces had used the holiday attacks to probe American defensive reaction, test communication procedures, and identify tactical vulnerabilities that could be exploited during larger operations. The intelligence gathered during these limited engagements proved invaluable for planning the coordinated attacks on urban targets that would define the next phase of the Vietnam conflict. American strategic response to the Christmas attacks reflected the broader challenges of fighting an unconventional war with conventional military forces. Massive firepower and technological superiority provided devastating responses to enemy action, but proved inadequate for preventing enemy initiative or protecting American forces from surprise attack. The fundamental asymmetry between American capabilities and enemy tactics created a conflict dynamic that favored the side willing to accept casualties in exchange for propaganda victory. The human cost of the Christmas Eve attacks extended beyond immediate casualties to affect thousands of family members who received notification that their loved ones had been wounded or killed during what should have been a peaceful holiday. Gold Star mothers and widows throughout America struggled to understand how enemy forces could justify attacking during Christmas, a question that reflected the cultural gap between American values and the pragmatic brutality of revolutionary warfare. The attacks also revealed the limitations of South Vietnamese military capability when American forces served as primary defenders rather than advisors. Army of the Republic of Vietnam units responded slowly to requests for assistance during the Christmas fighting, citing communication difficulties and command authority issues that highlighted the complicated relationship between Allied forces. This pattern would repeat throughout subsequent operations, with American units bearing primary responsibility for their own security, regardless of official partnership. Long-term consequences of the Christmas Eve attacks included modifications to American defensive architecture at installations throughout South Vietnam. Bunker construction accelerated, with improved overhead protection and better fields of fire designed to address vulnerabilities revealed by enemy action. Radar systems received enhanced capabilities for detecting incoming rockets, while communication systems were hardened against atmospheric interference that had complicated coordination during the attack. The psychological impact on American commanders proved as significant as tactical lessons learned from the engagement. The realization that enemy forces possessed intelligence, discipline, and tactical sophistication sufficient to coordinate multi-base attacks during American holidays forced a reassessment of enemy capabilities that had been consistently underestimated. This recognition came too late to prevent the Tet Offensive, but influenced planning for subsequent operations throughout the remainder of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Veterans of the Christmas Eve attacks carried emotional scars that lasted far beyond their tours of duty in Vietnam. Many described the engagement as a watershed moment when they realized that the enemy viewed American humanity as weakness rather than strength. The attacks had transformed Christmas from a symbol of hope and peace into a reminder of vulnerability and isolation, associations that would complicate holiday celebrations for decades after the war ended. The strategic deception achieved by enemy forces during the Christmas attacks demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American political and military psychology. By violating ceasefire agreements during a religious holiday, enemy commanders had achieved maximum propaganda impact while conducting tactically necessary reconnaissance operations. This dual-purpose approach reflected strategic thinking that American analysts had not anticipated from what they continued to characterize as primitive guerrilla forces. Declassified documents from North Vietnamese archives, released decades after the war, revealed that the Christmas Eve attacks had been planned as psychological warfare operations designed to undermine American morale, rather than achieve specific military objectives. Enemy commanders understood that attacking during holidays would create emotional trauma among American soldiers, while generating negative publicity that would influence American public opinion about continued military involvement in Southeast Asia. The technological response to the Christmas attacks included deployment of improved early warning systems and enhanced communication equipment designed to address specific vulnerabilities revealed during the engagement. Ground surveillance radar received sensitivity improvements that enhanced detection capability, while radio systems were modified to maintain communication effectiveness despite atmospheric interference. These upgrades represented incremental improvements rather than fundamental changes to American defensive concepts. Medical analysis of casualties from the Christmas Eve attacks revealed injury patterns that influenced subsequent training and equipment modifications. Fragmentation wounds from rocket and mortar attacks created specific trauma patterns that challenged field medical procedures, leading to improved training for combat medics and enhanced medical evacuation capability. The transition from holiday celebration to casualty treatment had created psychological stress among medical personnel that required attention from military psychiatrists. The strategic significance of the Christmas Eve attacks became fully apparent only when analyzed as part of the broader enemy campaign that culminated in the Tet Offensive. Intelligence gathered during the holiday engagements provided enemy planners with detailed information about American defensive capability, reaction time, and command procedure that proved invaluable for planning operations. The attacks had served as a dress rehearsal for more ambitious operations that would challenge American strategic assumptions about progress in Vietnam. As dawn broke on Christmas Day 1967, the silence that settled over Kontum Airbase carried the weight of innocence lost and illusions shattered. The improvised Christmas decorations that had survived the night now seemed like artifacts from another world, reminders of a brief moment when soldiers had allowed themselves to hope that humanity might transcend warfare. The tree made from artillery shells and parachute cord stood intact, but its symbolism had been transformed from hope to irony, from celebration to memorial. In the months that followed, no American commander in Vietnam would propose another Christmas ceasefire. The enemy had demonstrated that they viewed American holidays as opportunities rather than obstacles, tactical windows that could be exploited rather than sacred periods that transcended conflict. The lesson was clear and permanent. In Southeast Asia, war recognized no calendar, honored no traditions, and respected no boundaries between military and personal time. The jungle that surrounded Kontum had witnessed the attack with the same indifferent attention it had observed countless other human conflicts. Trees that had grown for centuries continued their patient growth, unmarked by the brief violence that had transformed human lives in the space of hours. The landscape that had served as sanctuary for enemy forces and trap for American defenders remained unchanged, a silent reminder that nature outlasts all human ambitions and conflict. The Christmas Eve attacks at Kontum became a defining moment for thousands of American soldiers who learned that war makes no exceptions for hope, offers no sanctuary for sentiment, and provides no immunity for those who believe in human decency. They had tried to pause warfare for the celebration of peace, only to discover that their enemy viewed such aspirations as tactical weaknesses to be exploited rather than human values to be respected. For many veterans of that Christmas Eve, the holiday would never again represent simple celebration, but would always carry the memory of how quickly peace could shatter into violence, how easily hope could transform into tragedy. They had learned that survival in Vietnam required abandoning the assumption that any moment was truly safe, that any location was genuinely secure, that any enemy would honor any agreement based on human rather than military considerations. The story of the Christmas Eve attacks at Kontum remains a profound reminder that warfare strips away civilized assumptions and reduces human interaction to its most primitive elements. In the jungles of Vietnam, American soldiers learned that their enemy respected neither their holidays nor their humanity, viewing both as psychological weaknesses that could be exploited for tactical advantage. The attacks had achieved their intended effect. American forces would never again allow sentiment to compromise security or hope to reduce vigilance. What happened to those young men who experienced that Christmas Eve transition from celebration to combat? How did they reconcile their desire for human connection with the brutal reality that their enemy viewed such desires as vulnerabilities? Can you imagine carrying those memories for 50 years, knowing that your attempt to honor the most peaceful holiday in human tradition had been met with rockets and mortars designed to kill you while you slept? Their sacrifice deserves remembrance, their courage demands recognition, and their story requires telling for generations who will never face such choices. If this account of their experience has moved you to understand the complexity of warfare and the price of freedom, please share it with others who need to know that liberty has always been purchased with blood, that peace has always been defended by those willing to fight, and that freedom has always been protected by young Americans far from home who stood watch while others slept safely. The aftermath of the Christmas Eve attacks revealed the profound human cost of warfare that extends far beyond battlefield casualty. In field hospitals throughout South Vietnam, wounded soldiers received treatment while Christmas carols played on armed forces radio, creating a surreal juxtaposition between celebration and suffering that would haunt medical personnel for decades. Navy corpsmen and Army medics worked through the night, their hands steady, despite the emotional weight of treating injuries inflicted during humanity's most sacred holiday. Private First Class Danny Morrison from Tennessee lay on a stretcher at the 18th Surgical Hospital in Pleiku, shrapnel wounds across his back, slowly healing, while his mind struggled to process what had happened. He had been writing a letter to his mother when the first rocket impacted, describing the improvised Christmas tree and the hope that maybe the war would pause for just one night. The letter, blood-stained and incomplete, was found in his pocket by medics who carefully preserved it along with his other personal effects. The psychological wounds proved more complex than the physical injury. Military psychiatrists noted increased incidence of combat stress reactions among soldiers who had experienced the transition from holiday celebration to life-threatening violence. The attacks had violated fundamental assumptions about human decency that many soldiers carried as emotional armor against the brutality they witnessed daily. When that armor cracked, the underlying trauma of sustained combat exposure often emerged in devastating ways. Captain Sarah Bennett, one of the few female officers stationed at the evacuation hospital, observed the unique psychological trauma created by attacks during holidays. "These boys came to us with wounds in their souls as well as their bodies," she recalled decades later. "They kept asking why anyone would attack on Christmas, as if warfare should respect our calendar. Learning that war makes no such exceptions was almost harder for them to accept than their physical injury." The intelligence analysis that followed the Christmas Eve attacks revealed the sophistication of enemy planning that had made the coordination possible. Intercepted radio communications showed that Viet Cong units had been rehearsing their assault plans for weeks, using detailed maps of American installations that included guard positions, equipment locations, and even the placement of improvised Christmas decorations. The enemy had turned American holiday preparations into tactical intelligence. Colonel James Patterson, the intelligence officer responsible for analyzing the attacks, discovered that enemy forces had infiltrated civilian construction crews working on base improvements during the preceding months. These infiltrators had provided detailed information about defensive preparations, including the location of ammunition storage area, fuel depots, and communication centers that became primary targets during the Christmas assault. The realization that enemy agents had worked alongside American soldiers for weeks created profound security concerns. The supply chain analysis revealed the extensive logistical preparation required for the coordinated attack. Chinese-manufactured 82mm mortar shells had been pre-positioned in concealed caches throughout the operational area, while Soviet-supplied rockets had been transported along jungle trails that American aerial reconnaissance had failed to detect. The enemy's ability to move heavy weapons and ammunition through dense jungle terrain demonstrated logistical capabilities that American intelligence had consistently underestimated. Communication intercepts provided insights into the enemy command structure that had planned and executed the Christmas attacks. North Vietnamese radio operators used code names that referenced American holiday traditions with bitter irony. Silent Night designated the timing for the assault, while Christmas Star indicated the signal to commence fire. The enemy's mocking appropriation of American cultural symbols added psychological insult to physical injury. The broader strategic context of the Christmas Eve attacks became clearer as intelligence analysts examined similar incidents throughout South Vietnam. Simultaneous attacks on American installations from the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone revealed a level of coordination that suggested centralized planning at the highest levels of North Vietnamese command. This was not spontaneous violence, but a carefully orchestrated operation designed to achieve specific psychological and tactical objectives. The technological response to the attacks included deployment of new sensor systems designed to detect enemy infiltration attempts before they could establish firing positions. Acoustic sensors capable of detecting approaching foot traffic were installed along likely infiltration routes, while improved night vision equipment enhanced the capabilities of perimeter guards. These technological solutions addressed some tactical vulnerabilities, but could not eliminate the fundamental challenge of defending against an enemy that chose the time and method of engagement. The training modifications that followed the Christmas attacks reflected lessons learned about the importance of maintaining combat readiness regardless of calendar considerations. Holiday stand-down procedures were eliminated, with combat units required to maintain full defensive posture throughout religious and cultural celebrations. The enemy had demonstrated that American sentiment could become a tactical weakness, forcing military planners to divorce operational security from emotional considerations. The political implications of the Christmas Eve attacks reached far beyond Vietnam to influence American public opinion about the war's progress and prospect. News reports of attacks on American soldiers during Christmas created powerful images that contradicted government assessments of improving security conditions. Television footage of wounded soldiers being evacuated while Christmas decorations burned in the background provided compelling evidence that victory remained distant despite official optimism. The attacks also revealed the limitations of South Vietnamese military capability when faced with coordinated enemy action. Army of the Republic of Vietnam units stationed near attacked American installations responded slowly and ineffectively, citing command confusion and communication difficulty. This pattern of Allied dependence on American forces for primary security functions highlighted fundamental weaknesses in the partnership that was supposed to enable eventual American withdrawal. The impact on military families throughout the United States proved as significant as the tactical consequences in Vietnam. Wives and mothers who had hoped for peaceful Christmas communications from their loved one instead received telegrams reporting injuries or death. The contrast between holiday expectations and brutal reality created psychological trauma among military dependents that military family support services were unprepared to address. Mary Ellen Rodriguez, whose husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, had coordinated defensive fires at Firebase Charlie, described the emotional whiplash of receiving news about the Christmas attacks. "I was decorating our tree with our kids when the phone rang," she remembered. "The voice on the other end told me Michael had been wounded but would survive. I should have felt relief, but all I could think about was how they had tried to kill him on Christmas. What kind of people attack on Christmas?" The medical consequences of the attacks extended beyond immediate battlefield casualties to affect the mental health of soldiers throughout American forces in Vietnam. The realization that enemy forces would exploit American holidays for tactical advantage created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that complicated efforts to maintain morale during subsequent holiday seasons. Military chaplains reported increased attendance at religious services, but also noted that soldiers struggled to reconcile their faith with the brutality they had experienced. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic chaplain who served multiple fire bases in the Central Highlands, observed the spiritual crisis that followed the Christmas attacks. "These young men came to me asking how God could allow attacks during his son's birthday," he recalled. "I had no easy answers. Faith doesn't make war less brutal, but somehow it helps us carry the weight of what we've witnessed." The challenge was helping them understand that their enemy's actions didn't diminish the sacred nature of what we were celebrating. The tactical innovations that emerged from analysis of the Christmas attacks influenced American defensive doctrine throughout the remainder of the conflict. Perimeter security procedures were modified to eliminate predictable patterns that enemy observers could exploit, while command protocols were adjusted to maintain combat readiness during periods previously considered safe. These changes reflected hard-learned lessons about an enemy that viewed American cultural observances as opportunities rather than obstacles. The psychological operations response to the Christmas attack attempted to exploit the propaganda opportunities created by enemy violations of holiday ceasefire agreements. American leaflets, distributed throughout contested areas, emphasized communist disregard for religious observances and civilian casualty, while radio broadcasts highlighted the contrast between American restraint and enemy aggression. However, the effectiveness of these messages remained questionable among populations that had endured years of warfare, regardless of which side claimed moral superiority. The long-term consequences of the Christmas Eve attacks included fundamental changes to American military culture in Vietnam. Holiday celebrations were transformed from opportunities for relaxation and reflection into periods requiring heightened vigilance and security measures. The enemy had succeeded in weaponizing American sentiment, forcing soldiers to view their own cultural traditions as potential vulnerabilities rather than sources of strength and comfort. The attacks also demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence capabilities that enemy forces had developed through years of fighting technologically superior opponents. American assumptions about primitive guerrilla organizations proved dangerously obsolete when confronted with enemy forces capable of coordinating multi-target operations with split-second timing. The Christmas attack served as a wake-up call for intelligence analysts who had underestimated enemy capabilities and intention. Individual accounts from soldiers who survived the Christmas Eve attacks revealed the personal transformation that combat can create in the space between heartbeats. Men who had been writing letters home, describing improvised holiday celebrations, found themselves calling in artillery strikes on their own perimeter defenses within minutes of the first enemy rocket impact. The psychological transition from peace to war consciousness required emotional adjustments that would influence their behavior for decades after returning home. Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Williams from Alabama described his experience during the attack on Firebase Delta in language that captured the surreal nature of combat during holidays. "We were singing Christmas carols when the mortars started falling," he remembered. "I went from harmonizing on Silent Night to screaming coordinates for counter-battery fire. The transition happened so fast that for a moment I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. But the blood was real enough, and so were the screams." The strategic deception achieved by enemy forces during the Christmas attacks proved more significant than the immediate tactical damage inflicted on American installations. By demonstrating their ability to coordinate complex operations during American holidays, enemy commanders had sent a clear message about their strategic intention and operational capability. The attacks served as a preview of the Tet Offensive that would commence 6 weeks later. revealing enemy confidence in their ability to challenge American forces throughout South Vietnam. The intelligence gathered during the Christmas attacks provided enemy planners with detailed information about American defensive procedures, response time, and command relationships that would prove invaluable during subsequent operations. American forces had been tested under combat conditions, with enemy observers carefully noting reaction patterns and tactical vulnerabilities that could be exploited during larger offensives. The Christmas attacks had served as a reconnaissance in force that achieved intelligence objectives while inflicting psychological damage on American morale. The technological lessons learned from the attacks influenced American defensive systems development for years after the Vietnam War ended. Radar systems received improvements designed to detect incoming rockets and mortars with greater accuracy, while communication equipment was hardened against atmospheric interference that had complicated coordination during the Christmas fighting. These evolutionary improvements addressed specific vulnerabilities revealed by enemy action, but could not eliminate the fundamental challenge of defending against attackers who chose the time and method of engagement. The human cost of the Christmas Eve attacks extended far beyond the soldiers who were wounded or killed during the fighting. Thousands of family members throughout America experienced the emotional trauma of learning that their loved ones had been attacked during what should have been a peaceful holiday. The psychological impact of such news during Christmas season created lasting associations between holiday celebrations and military tragedy that affected military families for generations. The broader implications of the Christmas attacks for American strategy in Vietnam became apparent only when viewed as part of the enemy's comprehensive psychological warfare campaign. By violating ceasefire agreements during religious holidays, enemy forces had achieved propaganda victories that multiplied the tactical success of their limited military actions. They had demonstrated that American sentiment could be weaponized against American interests, forcing military planners to divorce operational security from cultural and emotional considerations. As the immediate aftermath of the Christmas Eve attacks gave way to longer-term strategic analysis, American commanders began to understand that they faced an enemy whose sophistication and determination had been consistently underestimated. The attacks had revealed intelligence capability, logistical competence, and tactical discipline that contradicted assumptions about primitive guerrilla organizations. American forces would need to adjust their defensive doctrines and strategic expectations accordingly. The Christmas Eve attacks at Kontum and throughout South Vietnam's Central Highlands marked a turning point in American understanding of their enemy's capabilities and intentions. What had begun as an attempt to honor the peaceful spirit of Christmas had been transformed into a harsh lesson about the realities of revolutionary warfare. American soldiers had learned that their enemy respected neither their holidays nor their humanity, viewing both as psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for tactical advantage. The memory of that Christmas Eve would remain with survivors for the rest of their lives, a reminder that war recognizes no boundaries between military and personal time, offers no sanctuary for sentiment, and provides no immunity for those who believe in human decency. They had tried to pause warfare for the celebration of peace, only to discover that their enemy viewed such aspirations as strategic weaknesses to be exploited rather than human values to be respected. For the families who received news of casualties during Christmas 1967, the holiday would forever carry associations with loss and trauma that complicated decades of subsequent celebrations. The attacks had achieved their intended psychological effect, transforming America's most sacred holiday into a reminder of vulnerability and sacrifice that would influence public perception of the Vietnam War for years to come. The strategic lessons of the Christmas Eve attacks would prove prophetic when the massive Tet Offensive commenced 6 weeks later, revealing that the holiday attacks had served as reconnaissance and preparation for far more ambitious enemy operations. American forces had been tested and found vulnerable to coordinated attacks that exploited American cultural assumptions and defensive predictability. The enemy had demonstrated that they possessed the intelligence, discipline, and tactical sophistication necessary to challenge American forces throughout South Vietnam. The story of the Christmas Eve attacks serves as a profound reminder that warfare demands constant vigilance and accepts no exceptions for human sentiment. In the jungles of Vietnam, American soldiers learned that survival required abandoning assumptions about civilized behavior and maintaining defensive readiness regardless of calendar considerations. Their enemy had shown that revolutionary warfare recognizes no boundaries between military objectives and emotional vulnerability. viewing American humanity as a weakness to be exploited rather than a strength to be respected. These young Americans, many barely out of high school, had volunteered to serve their country in a distant land, fighting an enemy they didn't fully understand for objectives that weren't always clear. They deserved better intelligence, better strategic planning, and better understanding of the sophisticated adversary they faced. But they served with courage and dedication, despite these limitations, maintaining their humanity, while learning hard lessons about an enemy that viewed their humanity as a tactical vulnerability. Their sacrifice in defense of freedom deserves remembrance by generations who will never face such choices. Their courage under fire demands recognition from citizens who sleep safely because others stood watch. Their story requires telling to ensure that future Americans understand the price of liberty and the cost of freedom in a world where not everyone shares American values about human dignity and civilized conduct. The Christmas Eve attacks of 1967 remind us that freedom has always been defended by those willing to fight for it, that peace has always been preserved by those prepared for war, and that American values must be protected by American strength. If this account of their experience has helped you understand the complexity of warfare and the price of freedom, share it with others who need to know that liberty is not free, that democracy must be defended, and that American soldiers have always stood ready to pay whatever price freedom demands. Like and subscribe to ensure their stories continue reaching new audiences who must understand that every peaceful Christmas morning in America has been made possible by soldiers who spent their Christmas nights defending freedom in dangerous places, facing enemies who respected neither their holidays nor their humanity, making sacrifices that most Americans will never fully comprehend but must never forget.